cameras on. Woo. Anyone who feels comfortable,
Sorry if
turn
that
your
was loud.
cameras on. I would love to see people if you're like dressed and everything, you know.
Okay.
All right.
Do we think enough people are in here to get started?
I think so. I see the auditorium, and that's
Beautiful.
the crucial thing. We got our little auditorium audience there. All right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
so this was so this was an exciting little salvage operation of doing that shift to Zoom. You know, it's like sort of, you know, it's like launching a ship and it sinks as soon as you launch it and everybody hops on another ship or something. It's a very fun little salvage operation there, and actually ties in with what I was going to talk about. So because I was going to talk a little bit about flexibility and creativity, and this is definitely flexibility in action, and I appreciate all of your flexibility in being able to make that quick transition here. I think there's this bizarre stereotype of I think autistic people in particular, but neurodivergent people in general, as somehow lacking in flexibility. And I think that this is a projection, of course, that sort of the neurotypical mainstream expects neurodivergent people to constantly adapt to their standards. And it's a level of demand that's just impossible. And if we fall short of it even slightly, then we're accused of lacking flexibility. But in my experience, the neurodivergent people I know tend to be wildly flexible and creative. We're really actually quite good at this flexibility and adaptability, despite the stereotypes and despite having often been told our entire lives that we're not good at being flexible and, you know, not good with change. And certainly we have our own processes of going into change, which can, you know, take time and involve some careful integration time. But I think that also is a sign of a high level of skill with making shifts and adapting. I think that we tend of necessity to be an adaptable bunch, and often to come up with very resourceful adaptations. We kind of have to, because here we are operating in a society, in a culture that has norms that we don't fit into. And so right from the start, throughout our lives, we have to find these strategies of adaptability. And I think many of us become much better at it than we're given credit for. There's a real creative resourcefulness in neurodivergent communities and individuals. And sure enough, here we are as a result of our creative resourcefulness, surprise on Zoom, making that shift quite smoothly, because, you know, I've seen very neurotypical, very normative, like corporate meetings have tech issues and be completely unable to deal with them and just fumble around endlessly. So go us. So this is this creativity is of great interest to me, and a lot of the discourse around neurodiversity is about is disability focused. It's about accommodations, disability rights and accommodations and access. And I mean, you do this obviously, you know, Landmark College itself, you know, which I'm thrilled to finally be in dialogue with and visiting virtually. You know, Landmark College itself is a triumph of accessibility in that sense. How do you create a college environment that creates this broad accessibility to make higher education accessible. It's great stuff, and it's an essential part of the discourse and practice around around neurodiversity. But what I've been thinking about lately is the purpose of that, the broader purpose of that. And for us individuals, for us as individuals, neurodivergent individuals, we have our particular needs, our particular ways that we think and operate. And so obviously all of us as individuals benefit from having our access needs met, and from, you know, as in neurodivergent communities have worked really hard for a few decades now to push for our access needs to be met and to create spaces that are more accessible for us, and push for our needs to be accommodated. But in terms of the broader societal picture of just the community of the broader community of humanity, what why do we do this? Why do we seek accessibility and accommodation? Because there's alternatives. There's the possibility of like forming little separatist neurodivergent communities that we're going to be in this little community over here and have our and meet all our access needs, and not really interface with the rest of society. But what's the greater purpose, I think, why are we here in the first place? Why do humans have this capacity to be neurodivergent? Why does this wide variety of different styles of cognitive functioning exist within the human population? And I think that ultimately it's a creative resource, and diversity is always a source of creativity. If you look at if you look historically at great creative innovations and how society and culture have evolved, and arts and sciences have evolved, if you look at how these innovations happen, what we see is diversity is a source of creative synergy that we focus often on, on conflicts and difficulties that happen between different cultures and different groups of people, but also this synergy happens, this hybridization where cultures encounter each other and different approaches and different ways of thinking encounter each other. And there's a synergy out of which innovations and creativity are born. And neurodiversity is kind of that ultimate in terms of collective human creativity, that if there's a problem to be solved creatively, the more different perspectives and different ways of thinking are brought to bear on it, the more creative solutions we can generate. And that happens more when you get diversity, that it's not just a lot of individuals having their own different perspectives. It's not just a lot of individuals, this individual has this way of thinking and it gives them this perspective, and this individual has this way of thinking, it gives them this perspective. And that's a huge creative resource as it is. But there's also a whole new level of creativity and synergy that comes when from the chemistry between us, from the chemistry between different minds, when you get people who think very differently from each other and learn very differently from each other in communication with each other. Like, how do I explain myself? How do I explain my perspective to this other person? How do we understand each other? How do we find common ground and suddenly there's a synergy, there's a magic that happens there where ideas and understandings are born that none of the people involved could have come up with individually, but it arises out of the collective interaction of a diversity of minds and experiences. So that to me is kind of the a purpose of what we do. There's a purpose of on an individual level, we all want to get our needs met. We all want to get inclusion and get accommodated, have access. But the broader effect of that, the more diversity we can accommodate, the more creative synergy happens, and it becomes a creative resource for all of humanity at a time in history when humanity's kind of dug itself a pretty deep hole, and it really the more, so many currently existing systems are not working well, and the more minds we have, the more variety of perspectives and the more creative synergies we can generate as communities and as a species, the better things are going to go, the better our chances of moving towards a more positive future. So I'm very excited about that. And to me, that's sort of the evolutionary purpose of neurodiversity, and the big reason why human societies as a whole should be looking to embrace neurodiversity and allow maximum accommodation and maximum access for as broad a spectrum of different minds and ways of thinking as possible. So the challenge there is that we live in a society, the broader society has this paradigm of neuronormativity. There's these established societal norms of this is the way that people are supposed to think. This is the right way for minds to work, what we call sometimes, what neurodiversity scholars and activists sometimes call neurotypicality. There's no such thing as a neurotypical brain. That's not like there's a normal human brain. That's just biologically that doesn't exist. But we talk about neurotypicality, we're talking about sort of the social construction of this, these very narrow societal concepts of the normal way to think, the normal way to act, the normal way for minds to work. And it's entirely made up, and in fact, it shifts from culture to culture and shifts over time historically as well. But at any given time, there's this very narrow set of norms, and especially in times and societies like these where people have, on the whole, society has a particularly high level of intolerance for difference. What we're looking at is, this very narrow set of norms. And so when we talk about neurotypicality, we're talking not about some kind of normal brain, because there's no such thing. We're talking about conformity with a very narrow set of socially established, socially constructed norms that people come to believe are natural, but they're really just societally constructed, and different societies have constructed them differently. And when we talk about neurodivergence, we don't mean divergence from some fictional actual normal. We just mean not being in conformity with a narrow set of socially constructed norms, in some way, having one's body mind working outside of that narrow societal standard of what's normal. And so this, in a sense, what we're looking to do with the embrace of neurodiversity is really, in a sense, hit a point in the future where there is no neurotypical or neurodivergent, because it's just sort of understood that there is no normal mode of cognition. And it's just, how do we keep accommodating diversity? How do we accommodate whatever difference we encounter in terms of the way that minds can work? So the differences, have this creative potential in them, and the potential's lost when people can only be accepted through conformity. If you can, we have this wide range of neurodiversity within the human species, lots of different ways for minds to work. And sometimes I see, like on the, in corporate neurodiversity initiatives these days, people use this term neurodiversity, and they say they want different minds. They want a lot of variety of different styles of thinking and such. But actually, when you look at how it's put into practice, people are only welcome if they conform to certain social norms, and if they perform this neurotypicality, they perform in compliance with certain levels of neuronormativity. There's still an assumption that like neurodivergence is just barely tolerated if we try really hard to conform. But that that practice of conformity is actually eliminates a lot of the creative benefits. If you're busy spending your energy trying to pass for neurotypical in order to be accepted, then that's less energy that you have available to put into your actual creative potentials. So I think about this in terms of gender and queer theory, because this is something that the queer communities kind of hit on a while ago, over the past few decades, is this idea that heteronormativity, these strict male and female binary gender roles, where like you're born and you're assigned the role of male, or you're assigned the role of female, and you have to stay in that little box, and there's this very narrow way of performing your gender role involving, heterosexuality, and the masculine way to do everything and the feminine way to do everything. And there's this artificially created social binary. And which gets called, the queer theory is called heteronormativity, or these days cis heteronormativity. And so we talk about, with regards to gender and sexuality, we talk about queering normativity. It's like being queer means queering it, which essentially means subverting with it, creatively messing with it, escaping from the confines of these normative boxes. I'm not going to conform to these binary heteronormative gender roles, and to get outside of those gender roles, and in the process demonstrate that they're artificial social constructs. That's an act of what's called queering. And again, that heteronormativity and these limited binary gender roles, so boys have to act like this and girls have to act like this, that, when you think about it, that's a limitation on human creative potential. That's a way of restricting human creative potential, because there's so much creativity to be had once you're allowed to get outside of the little boxes that society puts you into. And so the same thing works around neurodiversity, that we can queer neuronormativity. We can say, yeah, I'm not going to conform or even try to conform to these normative standards if they're a bad fit for me. Like, well, what's a good fit for me? And I find that this actually is very entwined. This heteronormativity and neuronormativity are very entwined. So in a sense, neurodivergent people have also divergent ways of performing their gender, even if they're cisgender and heterosexual. There's a different way of thinking, a different way of using the body means a different way of doing gender. And so there's this entwining, it's this queering of normativity where we don't fit into the boxes, and this creatively subverting the little boxes of normativity and saying, well, okay, I'm going to really lean into my weirdness here. I'm going to really lean into that which makes me unique, and that which these internal stirrings, these internal promptings towards being myself, like this exploration of what actually works for me in terms of gender performance, in terms of how my mind works. I call that neuro-queering, and that whole act of not just being not just being born neurodivergent, not just being born with a way of thinking that's different from the majority of people in the world, but also actively leaning into that. There's this artificial division that we make sometimes of like, you're born neurotypical or you're born neurodivergent, but that's not really how it works. Some of us are born, with very distinctive ways of thinking, and some can conform to the norms more. But anybody can lean into their potentials for weirdness, for very unique ways of thinking and being. And the process of doing that increases the collective human creative capacity. It increases the potentials for human creative synergy by actually increasing our diversity. And I think that there's so often, when you see like the people in the corporate world use the term neurodiversity these days, they're talking about like, how can we accommodate a broader range of neurodiversity? How can we accommodate a broader range of ways of thinking because it's a source of innovation? But I'm thinking, like, let's go beyond that. Let's go beyond how can we accommodate the existing range and see how can we expand it? How can we expand the different diversity of perspectives and the diversity of ways of thinking by really actively leaning into what makes us unique, and by actively embracing, oh, wow, this person does things very differently from me. They think very differently. They're doing their gender in a way that had never occurred to me. Their perceptions and their perspective, like that would never have occurred to me. How do I adjust my own consciousness to make space for that, so that I'm not weirded out by this, but I'm like, whoa, that's really cool. What can I learn from this? So that's my talk. That's my little talk on neurodiversity and neuro-queering and what excites me about its creative potentials these days. And I wanted to keep it short because we did get off to a late start with our little last minute creative adaptation, but also I want to allow time for questions. And I'm happy to go a little bit over time from what was originally scheduled. Just want to open up the floor to, and Stellan, you probably have some particular way of gathering questions from people or something like that. And people are also welcome to pop questions in the chat or unmute or whatever, but I'm just gonna open it up and take a few questions in the time we've got.
We're doing it through me. Okay, sure. You can still hear me, correct?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Questions? Well.
So you mentioned a really interesting idea about like having like corporate employers trying to welcome neurodiversity, staying there, but then once they get there, that they expect people to work like this the ones that they have. Is there a way there's a way that both society as a whole, but also employers and corporate companies can kind of challenge this sort of asking of conformity.
Good to hear that.
Yeah, I think I was hearing a great question there and I couldn't catch all of it because it's done. Can you just confirm for me what was asked? Because that sounds like a great question.
Would you want me to repeat it?
Yeah, could you, here, I'm gonna do, we haven't had luck with it. I'm gonna try this. I think this is fine, yeah.
More creative problem solving. I love it.
Earlier on in your really useful sharing, you mentioned how like your idea of how like, you know, I actually totally understand this idea and this thing is that the corporate employers, they say they welcome neurodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
Then once they hire these people who are neurodivergent into their workplaces,
Mm-hmm.
they expect them to conform to social norms, even though they say,
Yes.
even though they market themselves as not doing so. Is there a way in which you think society as a whole, as well as these corporate employers can, and individuals as well in that case, can challenge and change this practice?
Social expectations aren't just set at
That's-
the top, they're also set within the layers of an organization.
That's a great question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a terrific question. Okay, yeah. So yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, here's the key is that I think a lot of the issue is that, you know, an institution like a corporation or a university, any organization or institution or community can set up policies, and more of them are doing that, can set up policies that welcome diversity. And increasingly, I'm seeing people become aware. You know, I give a lot of trainings at corporations and universities and such, and I see, okay, there's an increased awareness happening. It's got a long way to go, but there's an increased awareness of, yeah, different people have very different styles, like with different styles of mind come very different styles of communicating and very different styles of embodiment and doing things like eye contact or no eye contact, or you know, how we move, how we occupy space. And we can put that on paper. We can say, you know, as our policy as a corporation or as a university, that we're going to find ways to accommodate this, and we're not going to demand this normative performance. But no matter how well you set up the system, what happens is that individuals in the system get freaked out by the diversity. And I think that so there's this two levels to it. There's and one of them is just spreading awareness so that policies change. And I think that's happening. That's starting to happen. That we're seeing. I'm involved in a couple of projects right now of like writing, people putting together books on neurodiversity and creativity and human creative potentials. And I'm seeing just more and more people talk about that and persuade, you know, employers and universities to expand what they can accommodate and what they can tolerate. But individuals face to face, like an individual manager within a corporation, within a corporate department or something, individuals still get really freaked out because the sense of the normative gets deeply internalized by people in their upbringing. People are scared. People are raised and they're shamed for their deviations from normativity. They're shamed for their deviations from gender normativity, and they're shamed for their deviations from neuronormativity. You know, little children are told, "Oh, don't move that way. That's gay. Don't move that way. That's weird. You know, don't talk that way. That's weird." And people grow up with the shame about it. And what happens is then they see other people do the stuff that's outside of the normative, and that shame comes up for them, and they do whatever they can to shut down whatever is triggering that in them. So they try to, even if they come in with an intent of embracing neurodiversity, they shut down, in practice, they freak out. There's this shame and fear reaction that's deeply ingrained, and they then shut down, or they find that they run into this prejudice against the person who's like moving differently and communicating differently and such. And that's a really big obstacle. That, I think, is the big one that needs to be addressed, is even as the policies change, in practice, there's still this heavily imposed normativity once people are face to face with the deviations from normativity. And the solution to that really is about helping people transform, helping people face their prejudices and their internalized prejudices and their internalized normativity. And that's challenging. And I also believe it can be done. I come from a different background, because a lot of people coming in, a lot of people working in the field of neurodiversity and gender diversity, neurodiversity, a lot of people working in these fields and looking to create more accommodations are coming from a background in diversity kind of work, a background in disability studies or disability rights activism. I come from a background as a mindfulness teacher, and I'm a meditation practitioner and an Aikido teacher. I've been an Aikido teacher for more than 40 years. And so my specialty really is not in diversity related work per se. My specialty is actually in helping people make inner transformations. And so I know that is a work that can be done, and it requires a certain mindfulness training. It requires people to practice catching themselves, like learning to notice, oh, wow, there's something coming up for me. So that when someone is face to face with, oh my God, the way this person moves is so weird, it's freaking me out. They're like, their first impulse, instead of shutting it down and rejecting the person and trying to make them stop being weird, their first impulse should be, well, why is this bothering me? Why is this bothering me? And is there a way for me to relax and be present with it and not be so bothered by it? Is there a way for me to make a shift in my consciousness so I can accept it? And that's a big shift. And that requires a deep level of mindfulness training. And I think society is way behind on that. If you look at the way people talk at each other on social media, like, people are very reactive and not very self-reflective and mindful like that. But those are skills that can be learned. And we're actually seeing that starting to happen in the corporate worlds, where people are talking about, doing more mindfulness training. There's actually a lot of emphasis happening now on the importance of mindfulness practices for people to be able to function in this information-heavy world. So I think there's an in there. I think that there's something that we can start doing in the world about training people to be more self-reflective about their own reactions to difference. And that's really what has to happen in the long run. Not an easy process, but a possible process. All right, other questions?
We've got a question more on the thing we were just talking about. Questionary?
A little. Let me. Let's see. Oh, yes, approaching the microphone. Excellent. Wonderful.
Yay.
Oh, there we go.
So it's a comment on what we were just talking about. It's like one thing that would be, well, first of all, like society's like hustle culture and capitalism and like the wages not being high enough encourages people to work, and then sleep like the dead when they're not working. And we're moving away from that towards work-life balance, but there's not a lot of time for thinking about things. There's not a lot of encouragement to introspect, to understand your own feelings and things. It's just like conform to the standard and make enough money to survive and then keep moving. And maybe one day you'll win the lottery and with the so-called American dream. But like also a good way to teach mindfulness is not only integrating into work programs and stuff, but also to do it from the ground up and integrate it into educational systems.
Yes.
I mean, obviously already like schools are not underfunded and teachers are underpaid and it's not really great right now, but it's important to teach kids and teens, especially when you're like growing up in that volatile and awkward time when you're like got hormones going on, your brain's growing up, and it's just really a lot of things to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and think about how you feel about things and why you feel about that about it, which is like, because like sometimes it's just like sort of, I mean, it's because of depression I've gotten into the habit of introspection. It's like I'm not doing something else because I'm depressed, and I'm ruminate is the word I was looking for, on the thought or the feeling. And that is an important skill to learn, but it is a skill, and it would be easier for people to learn if it was taught earlier.
Yes, very good point. Yes, I fully agree. And I think I've become an optimist, which is unfashionable these days, but people are seeing, I think the cracks in the existing systems are becoming more apparent. People are seeing, wow, this isn't working. Late stage capitalism isn't working. The hustle culture, as you described it, just the real awfulness of the underfunded education system. Current systems are not working; they're falling apart, and people see that, and obviously that's not pleasant. But I like this thinking ahead, and this is something we can do because we're neurodivergent people. We're outside of the box thinkers. What happens next? If the systems are collapsing, it's time now to start thinking about what we're going to be replacing them with, what we're going to build in their place. And that's something I'm really seeing. Like we have, capitalist society, the corporate hustle culture and the increasing privatization of space in general, the way people are kept busy all the time. It's eroded community. It's eroded, like there aren't really community spaces where people spend time together and talk and just create community without a for-profit goal. But that's shifting, that's starting to change because people are hungry for that, because that's part of what we do as people. It's such a human thing to just want to be in the community, even if it's a very unusual community, or especially if it's very unusual community, to want to make connections for not for profit purposes, but just for the purpose of basic human connection. We are social creatures, even, autistic people who get accused of not being able to do social stuff. We actually have our very, unique and beautiful ways of doing the whole social thing. And so I think people are looking for that. This is what I've discovered. I've discovered, like teaching Aikido, for instance, people discover, oh, wow, I can join this like Aikido school, and it's a community. And what I always discover every time I'm involved in something like that, where people have the opportunity to get together and do something as a group that's not corporate profit driven. People are so hungry for community, and people are so hungry to build these structures that the mainstream top-down society is not providing for them. And so I think we're just going to see more and more of that, people finding ways to build in the cracks of the crumbling old system. I'm very struck by Ziauddin Sardar, as a futurist, scholar in the field of future studies, came up with this term several years ago. He said, we're living now in post-normal times. And I love that phrase, post-normal times. So we are that essentially the old normal is collapsed. And one reason that we're seeing, for instance, increased, like rise of fascism in a lot of communities, and rise of, transphobia and homophobia and racism, white supremacism. And one reason we're seeing so much of that these days is that the old norms are collapsing, and there are people, who are desperate to hang on to them, who are desperate to hang on to some something that's already essentially over. And in a sense, we're witnessing the last, the death throes of old systems that have really outlived their time. We're entering post-normal times. There's no normal that people agree on anymore. Even I remember when I was a kid, there were heavy debates about, there's a political polarization, left wing, right wing, but the debates tended to be over what do we do? These are the problems, and what's the right way to deal with them? How do we move forward from here? At this point, we have a kind of polarization where people don't even agree on basic facts. And that's really extraordinary, that we disagree on how to deal with the problem, but we disagree not only on what the problem is, but on like really simple facts and realities. And that's a sign of post-normal times. That's a sign of the chaos of post-normal times. That's not sustainable. New normals end up emerging, new norms, new ways of being have to emerge from this. And so then the question is, what do we want them to be? Because this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity. The times we live in, as catastrophic as they are in many ways, are an opportunity to create new systems as old systems crumble. And so, part of that is maybe creating more mindful communities, more intentional communities that where people do reflect more on what do we want, who do we want to be? Who do we want to be? What do we want our cultures to be like? All right, let me I see a hand up over there on the screen.
Tim's gonna run up with a close-up so you can hear.
Excellent, thank you, yes.
So how do you base anything you're saying in facts? Because to me, I feel I've objectively looked at the world, and you sound like, I'm saying this as politely as I possibly can. You sound like you have a lot of words and not a lot of.
Oh, sorry, I missed some of that. I heard a lot of words, and then I didn't hear any more words.
A lot of points, and not a lot of points.
A lot of points. Oh, interesting. Is there a question in there? Is there something you want clarification on? Because
I want to know, why do you believe all of these things, why do you believe neurodiversity is good? Because
the sound keeps cutting out. I'm sorry. Yeah. I heard, why do you believe neurodiversity is good?
What is your basis for thinking this way?
Oh.
Why do you believe that?
Okay. That's a great question. That's fascinating. Well, why I am I'm getting old, and I've had a lot of time in my life to try on a lot of different perspectives. And to a certain extent, a lot of the important truths are unknowable. We can know basic, 2 + 2 = 4 facts, and the world is round and not flat facts. But a lot of these things are unknowable in terms of certainty. Is neurodiversity good or bad, or is this approach going to be good or bad? And all of these questions aren't answerable in an objective way, like a math equation is answerable. In a sense, a lot of the answers are really about not what's objectively true, but what's useful. What's useful to believe? Because these ideas are tools. Ideas are the tools with which we build our reality. So is neurodiversity good? Well, neurodiversity is. I mean, we know that neurodiversity exists. That is, we know that different people's nervous systems and perceptions work differently from each other. Just the fact that I can come in and say the stuff I say, and then you can have a question like that, shows that people think differently from each other. We don't all think the same. So clearly, neurodiversity is the fact we have. Oh yeah, okay, people perceive and think differently from each other. Now the question is, well, what do we do with that? What do we do with that fact? And the way I approach something like that is I say, well, what's a useful way to approach it? If I think, if I decide to believe that neurodiversity is a bad thing or that it's a problem, how is that useful to me? It sounds like I would just be pretty bummed out because neurodiversity is everywhere. I'm, neurodivergent myself, clearly think differently from the majority. Same with a lot of the people I care about. And here we have this world, this human species that is a neurodiverse species. If we decide that it's a problem, well, what are we going to do about it? I mean, attempts to reduce human diversity have historically not worked out well and have often resulted in atrocity. So clearly it's more constructive to believe in the creative potentials and say, this is an opportunity. So in a sense, my belief that neurodiversity is a good thing and has these creative potentials is itself, the belief itself is an act of creativity. That is, I'm making a choice to believe something because I found that it's a belief that leads in a constructive direction and opens up possibilities for creativity. Whereas if I were to believe something else, like neurodiversity is a problem, or it's bad to be neurodivergent, or there's no creative potential there, that just feels like kind of a dead end to me. Like, what am I going to do with that? That doesn't do anything useful for me or for the world or the people I work with. And consistently, what I find is the people who choose to believe in these creative potentials are then able to realize them and do something positive with them. So yeah, that's my answer. It's not a satisfying answer to anyone who wants certainty, because I don't think, I think there is a great deal in the world that we can't be certain of. And I think that creativity ultimately involves a certain willingness to tolerate uncertainty and work creatively with uncertainties instead of trying to nail down certainty. All right, other questions? I think we have time for like one more question. We started a little late, so I'm going to go a little late. So let's get maybe one more from someone who hasn't gotten a question in yet.
May I ask a question?
Sure, go for it.
I noticed in a lot of the readings that a lot of the passages and articles that you've written, that you talk a lot about first person versus third person speech. And I would just like some more clarity on it, because you mention it a lot, but don't give a full explanation.
Third person speech.
When talking in context of neurodiversity in most places, where like being autistic versus having autism.
Oh yeah, like person first language versus yeah. Okay, I get what you're saying. Yes. Yeah, and that's another instance where I'm thinking in terms of utility. That is, I'm thinking in terms of, and I do have a chapter later on. And I do have a piece I wrote about person first language related to autism specifically. But so often, again, I have a particular orientation towards language based on an understanding that language is a tool and that we use it to shape our realities. And so I think often, if I'm going to adopt a concept or a way of speaking or a belief, I'm thinking, what's its purpose? What's the purpose of this? Is this serving a creative purpose? Is it making me a better person? Is it opening up creative potentials? Is it leading me? Is it improving my quality of life and the quality of life of the people I deal with and relate to? Or, is it limiting me in some way? And so, the autistic community in general, sort of a broad thing within much of the autistic community these days is, and for a while now, has been preferring identity first language, saying autistic person instead of person with autism. And some people, other people's reasons for that might be different from mine. But my reason is that what I see is that when people use the person first language, when they say person with autism, or this person has autism, it creates creates sort of the illusion that that the autism is this separate thing that can be separated out from the person. And it really can't be. Like, there is, if someone has measles, you can have like a little test tube full of measles virus, which you should not open. But you can have like, a test tube, or you can have a test tube, you have a little sample of the COVID virus, and you can see with a sufficiently strong microscope. There's no autism virus, you can't see autism under a microscope, no matter how good the microscope is. There's just autistic people, and autism doesn't exist outside of people. It's not roaming around in the air. So when you talk about a person having autism or being a person with autism, you create this illusion that autism can be separated from the person. And historically, the effect that that has had in the world is that it leads people, like parents who would rather not have an autistic child, for instance. It leads people to believe that the autism can somehow be removed from the person. And that's created that drives the whole industry of like fraudulent or dangerous, alleged autism cures that don't actually cure autism because it's not really a disease. It can't be removed from a person. And it shifts the focus to that, where parents have an autistic child, and if they think of it as a child with autism, and oh, my child has autism, they'll tend to look for a way to help their child by removing the autism from them. And that's not a constructive path. That hasn't worked out well for autistic people historically or in the present day. If you say autistic person, that implies, oh, this person is autistic in the same way this person is, male or female or non-binary or short or tall or whatever. Like, it's a quality, it's a trait that the person has. It's just another adjective. It's a trait the person has in the sense of like their ethnicity or their gender or something. Oh, they're autistic and they're, and they're 5.5 feet tall and they're North American and they're male or female, it takes that whole disease model away and just says, okay, this is an autistic person. So let's start from there. My kid is autistic. How do I help them thrive as an autistic person? It starts with the assumption, yeah, okay, they're autistic. So what do I do with that? Instead of they have autism and the autism needs to be removed, they are autistic. And so what do I do with an autistic kid? How do I teach them to live well as an autistic person? And so I think that promotes a more constructive kind of practice where people think, where you start from accepting that the person is autistic and that that's not going to change. And then you say, well, given that the person is autistic, how do we make the most of that? How do we bring out the best potential qualities of that? How do we accommodate that and use it constructively? So that's why I prefer personally saying autistic person, is that I think that it leads to a more constructive approach, a more constructive way of thinking about it that leads to more constructive practices. And again, so much of my orientation towards language is like that. So much of it is about not these are objective facts, this is the way it has to be, but this is a really useful way to frame it because it leads to more constructive practices than this other way. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're kind of out of time here. We've gone a little bit over the planned time, and I really appreciate you all bearing with this surprise shift of platform and staying for extra time. So appreciate your flexibility. It's been wonderful to see you all. Faculty and staff, I'll have another opportunity to meet with you all tomorrow. And people who have, students who have questions for faculty and staff or questions from me that you didn't get a chance to ask, feel free to hand them off to faculty and staff members to ask me tomorrow, because I'll have a little more time to address questions with faculty and staff tomorrow. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you.